Hi guys, today I'm going to be talking about deductive reasoning. Okay, so there are two main kinds of reasoning. The first kind is inductive reasoning, which is reasoning about what is probably true based on multiple pieces of evidence and observations. We'll talk more about inductive reasoning later in the semester, but let me just give you a quick example now. Let's say a scientist might make observations of people with schizophrenia, such as measuring the amount of various chemicals in their brain. She might observe that people with schizophrenia have too much of a certain neurotransmitter in their brain called dopamine. The question is, what might she conclude from this evidence? Well, she might reason from these observations to a general theory or principle that too much dopamine causes people to have schizophrenia. Note that this conclusion might be wrong. Schizophrenia might be caused by something else, and it's just a coincidence that her schizophrenic subjects all had too much dopamine in their brain, but this is the best conclusion that can be drawn based on the evidence that's available. So her type of thinking is an example of inductive reasoning, reasoning about what is probably true based on multiple pieces of evidence and observations. Deductive reasoning is the opposite, reasoning about what must be true of a particular case based on the application of a general principle. For example, it would be reasoning from what a doctor knows about schizophrenia in general to draw conclusions about a particular person. That is, it is generally accepted that schizophrenia is caused by too much dopamine. And so, if some patient, let's call him Stephen, is diagnosed with having schizophrenia, then through deductive reasoning, a doctor might conclude that Stephen has too much dopamine in his brain. The doctor is taking this general principle about schizophrenia and applying it to Stephen's particular case. Now, when we discuss deductive reasoning today, we're going to look at conditional deductive arguments, which is a deductive argument in an if, then, therefore form. If we were going to put our schizophrenia example into this style of argument, it would look something like this. If a person has schizophrenia, then that person has too much dopamine in their brain. Stephen has schizophrenia. Therefore, Stephen has too much dopamine in his brain. Note that again, we're arguing from a general statement. If a person has schizophrenia, then that person has too much dopamine in their brain, to a specific case about Stephen, and we are drawing a conclusion about what must be true. Therefore, Stephen has too much dopamine in his brain. Typically, conditional deductive arguments contain two premises followed by one conclusion. Premises are assertions or pieces of evidence that relate to a conclusion. And again, most conditional deductive arguments contain two premises. The first premise contains the antecedent, which is the if part, and the consequent, which is the then part. In our example, premise 1 would be the general statement about schizophrenia being caused by too much dopamine in a person's brain. The antecedent would be the if part, if a person has schizophrenia, and the consequent would be the then part, then that person has too much dopamine in their brain. Premise 2 states that something is true or not true in a particular case. So a lot of students confuse the consequent with premise 2. These are not the same thing. The consequent is the then part of premise 1, whereas the second premise is about applying the general principle to a particular case. In our example, premise 2 would be Stephen has schizophrenia. And finally, the conclusion is a statement about the case described in premise 2 that follows logically from premise 1. In our example, it would be that Stephen has too much dopamine. Let's look at one more example so you can get a better sense of what the premise 1 and premise 2 and the antecedent and the conclusion and the like are. So here's another example. If an animal has wings, then it can fly. Eagles have wings, therefore eagles can fly. So the very first line is the first premise, premise 1, which is if an animal has wings, then it can fly. The if part of premise 1, if an animal has wings, that's the antecedent. And then the second part, the then part, then it can fly, is the consequent. The second line is the second premise, premise 2, eagles have wings. And then finally, the third line is the conclusion, therefore eagles can fly. Now, when we look at deductive arguments from a critical thinking perspective, what we want to be able to tell is whether or not they are valid and whether or not they are sound. First, let's talk about what it means for a deductive argument to be valid. So an argument is valid if it follows a form where its conclusion must be true if its premises are true. Validity says nothing about the premises themselves being true. only that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. The key point here is that the form of the argument determines whether it is valid or not. That is, there are several forms of valid arguments and several forms of invalid arguments. In this course, we're going to look at one valid form and one invalid form. But basically, if a form isn't the valid form we're going to look at, you should assume it is invalid. So first, this is the valid form of argument that we're going to be looking at in this course. And again, any other form for you all, you should assume that it is invalid. The general style of our valid form is if P then Q, P therefore Q. So what the heck does this mean? Well, this form is called affirming the antecedent. And this is because the second premise in this argument is saying that the antecedent is true. Let's see why this is the case by applying this form to a classic example. So the example is, if someone is a man, then that person is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. P is the antecedent if someone is a man, and Q stands for the consequent, then that person is mortal. What determines the argument's form is the second premise. In this case, Socrates is a man. Note that the second premise is saying that the antecedent, P, if someone is a man, is true. So again, this is why this form is called affirming the antecedent, because the second premise is saying that the antecedent is true. And the reason this form is always valid is because if we assume that these premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. That is, if we assume premise 1 is true, that if someone is a man, then that person is mortal, and we assume that premise 2 is true, that Socrates is a man, then the conclusion has to be true, that Socrates is mortal. Let's go over a few more example conditional deductive arguments to see if they are valid or invalid. Remember, all you need to do to determine if an argument is valid or not is to look at the form. If the second premise is saying that the antecedent, the if part, is true, then it is valid. So consider this example. If today is Wednesday, then I have critical thinking. Today is Wednesday, therefore I do have critical thinking. So is this argument valid? Well, yes, it would be valid because it's the right form. The second premise, today is Wednesday, is saying that the antecedent, if today is Wednesday, is true. So this is in the form of affirming the antecedent, meaning that this argument is valid. What about this example? If an animal has wings, then it can fly. Penguins have wings, therefore penguins can fly. Is it valid? Yes, it is valid because once again it follows the correct form. The second premise is saying that the antecedent, if an animal has wings, is true. And again, notice how if we accept that the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That is, if we accept that it is true that if an animal has wings, then it can fly, and we accept it's true that penguins have wings, then it must be the case that penguins can fly. What about this example? Is it valid? If someone owns Fort Knox, then that person is rich. Bill Gates is rich, therefore Bill Gates owns Fort Knox. Is it valid? No, it is not valid because it is in a different form called affirming the consequent. Notice that the second premise is not saying that the antecedent is true, instead it is saying that the consequent, that a particular person is rich, is true. And again, for our purposes, if the form isn't affirming the antecedent, then it will be invalid. So the reason that this form affirming the consequent is always invalid is because even if we accept that the premises are true, it doesn't mean that the conclusion is true. That is, even if we accept as true that if a person who owns Fort Knox would be rich, and that there is a particular person who is rich, it doesn't necessarily follow that this particular rich person must own Fort Knox. Right? He or she might be rich for other reasons other than that they own Fort Knox. For example, that they own a successful company. How about this example? If an animal is a robin, then it is a bird. This animal here on the PowerPoint slide is a bird, therefore this is a robin. Is it valid? No, it isn't, because again it follows a different form of affirming the consequent. And this is because the second premise is saying that the consequent, this animal is a bird, is true. And remember, affirming the consequent would always be an invalid form. Let's do one more example. If a person has scars on his body, then that person has been abducted by aliens. Charlie has scars on his body, therefore Charlie has been abducted by aliens. Is it valid? Yes, it is, for all the reasons we've been talking about, that the second premise, that Charlie has scars on his body, is saying that the antecedent is true. But should we believe that you've been abducted by aliens if you have scars on your body? Well, probably not, no. So, what this demonstrates is the difference between validity and soundness. Remember, all that valid means is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. However, it doesn't mean that the premises themselves are actually true. And obviously, if the premises in an argument aren't true, then the conclusion of that argument won't be true. So, in addition to determining if an argument is valid, you also have to determine if it is sound. And an argument is sound if it is valid and its premises are true. By true, I just mean that they are consistent with our knowledge of the world. So let's go through a couple of examples looking to see if an argument is sound or not. So let's take this one. If someone is a man, then that person's mortal. Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal. Is the argument sound? Yes, it is sound because both of those things are true. The argument is valid, like we've talked about already. It follows the correct form of affirming the antecedent, and both of its premises are true. So the premise, if someone is a man, then that person is mortal, is true. And yeah, we'll assume that there is some guy named Socrates, so that the second premise is true as well. How about this one? If an animal has wings, then it can fly. Penguins have wings, therefore penguins can fly. Is this argument sound? Well, like we talked about, the argument is valid, but it is not sound because the first premise is not true. Right? It's not true that if an animal has wings, then it can fly. So again, because one of the premises is false, that makes this argument not sound, and so we shouldn't believe the conclusion then that penguins can fly. How about this one? If Clarice is a psychology major, then she is a student. Clarice is a student, therefore she is a psychology major. Is this argument sound? Well, for the sake of argument, we might assume that the two premises are true. However, the argument is still not sound because this is not a valid argument. So, first thing we want to check, is the argument valid? No, it isn't. This is affirming the consequent. The second premise is saying that the consequent is true, not that the antecedent is true. So it's an invalid argument, meaning it's not sound, and so we shouldn't believe the conclusion. So now, let's go back to our scars example. If a person has scars on his body, then that person has been abducted by aliens. Charlie has scars on his body, therefore Charlie has been abducted by aliens. We said that it is valid, so shouldn't we definitely accept the conclusion that Charlie has been abducted by aliens? Well, no, we shouldn't, because this argument is not sound, because the first premise is not true, right? Just because somebody has scars, it doesn't mean that that person has been abducted by aliens. So again, even though this argument is valid, because it is not sound, the conclusion is not true, and thus it shouldn't be believed. Alright, so let's summarize the two key takeaway messages from today's PowerPoint. The first is that the conclusion of a valid and sound deductive argument must be true. This is what it means for an argument to be both valid and sound, that the conclusion must be true. Valid means that if we accept the premises as true, then the conclusion must be true. And sound means that, yeah, the premises are true. This is why deductive reasoning is so useful, because if the argument is both valid and sound, then its conclusion must be true. Second key point, though, is that if the argument is invalid or the argument is not sound, then its conclusion is not true. Going back to our previous examples, we saw that if an argument is not valid or if an argument is not sound, then its conclusion isn't true. And so the ability to identify invalid arguments or faulty premises, those that aren't supported by good evidence, is important for critical thinking. All right, that's all I have for you guys today.